He's like, we didn't see him all this time.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are, and welcome to the first installment of 2017 ACLS webinar series. The Association of Consultants for Liturgical Space is a voluntary membership organization of professionals dedicated to the creation of beautiful worship spaces for faith communities. This webinar series is part of our commitment to providing mutual professional support and continuing education for our members. I'm Jim Hunt of Foresight Architects in upstate New York, and if I did this right, you should be seeing an image of the woods up north, which will be there until we get our speaker ready. I'm the webinar facilitator for the ACLS Communications Committee, and it's my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar. Before we get started, for those who are new to GoToWebinar, I'd like to orient you to the GoToWebinar control panel. The control panel includes options for raising your hand, for typing in questions, and for chatting. If you would like to ask questions of the presenter, please type them into the question box and we'll respond to those questions at the end of the presentation. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the chat function and direct your comments to the ACLS organizer, which is me. If you have trouble with the audio, you can use the phone number in your invitation to listen in on the phone. And if you have other difficulties, you can leave the webinar and use the link you were provided with to sign in again. If all else fails, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the ACLS website in 3 months. Today we'll be using a different format with a live speaker, so you'll be seeing the speaker rather than a presentation. With our presenter, Father Dave, is Sister Marilyn and Laura Bertoni. Sister Marilyn, who is an ACLS board member, and Laura Bertoni and Rose Diaz from the Archdiocese of San Francisco Office of Worship. This is our first attempt at a live webinar, so if there are any difficulties, please let us know. Okay, so let me introduce our presenter, Father Dave Pettingill. Father is a retired priest of the San Francisco Archdiocese who is still active in retreat work and teaching courses on the Council for Lay Ecclesial Ministers. Ordained just months before the opening of the Second Vatican Council, Father Dave since spent 22 years in education, first at the high school level and later as Dean of Students and Professor of Homiletics, Liturgical Celebration and Scripture at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park. He has since served in a variety of pastoral and leadership roles in the Archdiocese of San Francisco, including Director of the Deacon Formation Program for the last 5 years before retiring in 2007. And we are now going to unmute our speaker and welcome Father Dave.
Thank you very much, Jim. And may I say welcome to all of the viewers here. I, at one time in my ministry, was part of the Liturgical Commission, a subcommittee on art, environment, and architecture. And I must say that I said yes to Sister Marilyn because of the association and collaboration with excellent people. They were so passionate, so competent, and so devoted, including our Director of the Office of Worship, Laura Bertoni, who is sitting right across from me now. And so when I was asked to do this, although I have never done anything like this before, I said yes because of the fine people that are out there. Secondly, I understand that for most of us that work in any type of ministry, we run across pharaohs who know not Joseph. We have people in charge who can frustrate us, frustrate the vision of Vatican II, reinterpret it, and especially if they have power, they can actually stop things that are so wonderful. And so I would like this to be a rally for the spirits of all you wonderful people that are watching and listening today. Hopefully, it will give you an injection of hope if you need it. If not, it will just marshal you to go in the direction you're already going. And so either way, it's a win-win situation. I'd like to begin with an introduction explaining the title. It's called Poisoning the Wells. Now, first of all, when you hear about well poisoning, you might think about the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and some well is poisoned, and anyone that comes to drink from that particular well is certainly affected by the poison. But I would like to use it in a very specific way and commemorate someone that I thought was a marvelous person in my life. The person is Father Frank Norris. He is a priest of the Society of Saint-Sulpice, now residing in Seeing God Face to Face. But he was, first of all, a teacher who prepared me for Vatican II when I was going through theology myself. And secondly, I became a colleague of his when I was on the faculty and a very close friend. And Frank himself was an expert at the Second Vatican Council, a peritus, who was much valued, and the only book he wrote was called God's Own People, with a foreword by Cardinal Yves Congar. So Frank was in no way a lightweight to be reckoned with and to be cherished. And he used the term poisoning the wells in this sense, that we can do things, sometimes large, sometimes small, but the point is that Vatican II did happen. It is a real factor in church life, and it's not to be neglected or avoided or dodged or watered down. And so any little thing as well as large thing that we can do to influence Second Vatican Council's reception, and it will take at least 100 years till it's fully received, then hooray for us, and therefore hooray for this gathering. I'd like to divide my well-poisoning presentation into 5 parts. First of all, the intent of the Second Vatican Council for Catholic liturgy. Secondly, the reform of the reform. Thirdly, the state of the union right now. Fourthly, what we might do with our expertise and cunning, and perhaps dusting off our Machiavelli, to further the cause of Vatican II and our own expertise. And finally, Q and hopefully A's to follow at the end. So that's what I propose to do. So let me get at it by talking about the intent of the Catholic liturgy as described by the Second Vatican Council. And first, I would like to roast a couple of chestnuts that are very valid. The first roasting would be that Vatican II, again, is in the process of being received, which means it takes about 100 years for a council to sink in and people to get used to it, be at home with it, and make it their own. So we're in still the reception process. Secondly, there are 16 documents of the Second Vatican Council, and that they are always to be interpreted in the light of each other. You don't just take one document and say, this is it. You must allow them to comment upon each other and to create a unity of vision from that. The third point I'd like to make is, in interpreting, is this, that the way you interpret Vatican II is, of course, by looking at the literary form of all 16 documents, and the literary form is panegyric. That means a description of what the document is talking about that is so attractive that you would like to come and jump in and be part of it. An example would be Tom Sawyer in Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Tom was being punished on a Saturday by the Aunt Polly, as he always was, and he was assigned to whitewash the fence. And, of course, Tom, being ingenious, begins whitewashing the fence, but doing it in such a way that it looks like an ecstatic experience. So some of his less gifted friends say, please, could we do the whitewashing of the fence? And after they begged and begged, he allowed them to do it and then went off fishing. The point being that the documents of Vatican II want to make church existence and church relationship to the modern world so attractive that people would jump in. Secondly, the other hermeneutic or principle of interpretation that I have articulated already is you take the documents in consort with one another so that they shed light on each other. So having said that, let's talk about the liturgy document. Now, I'd call your attention to something that is really very amazing. In the liturgy document, we find within 6 paragraphs the same thing said. Paragraph 7, paragraph 10, and paragraph 13, that the liturgy is the most important thing the church does. Let me read each of those. Here's paragraph 7. From this it follows that every liturgical celebration, because it is an action of Christ the priest and of his body the church, is a sacred action surpassing all others. No other action of the church can match its claim to efficacy, nor equal the degree of it. Then, chapter 10, nevertheless, the liturgy is the summit toward which all the activity of the church is directed, and at the same time, it is the fountain from which all of her power flows. And finally, paragraph 13, since the liturgy, by its very nature, far surpasses any of them. The them means private devotions. 3 times within 6 paragraphs, we have extolling the liturgy, and we have to ask the question, didn't they have editors? Or were the fathers of the Vatican Council so worried about the fact that Catholic liturgy was grossly unappreciated, not participated in, and was not any of the things they were saying it is? Was the value of liturgy lost in a miasma of private devotions, some of which were superstitious, some mindless, and some having no bearing on the liturgy, either leading to it or drawing their inspiration from it? The fathers thought we have to get people back to the most important thing we do. And so we have to ask some questions. Well, why did they say that? Well, let's start in with number 1. Liturgy was not appreciated. First of all, it was not in the language of the people. It was done by professionals, those who were ordained. It was done in such a way that they were there to be present and nothing more. And you find even then that some people brought their own amusements, their private devotions. Others said their own masses by reading a missal parallel to what the priest was doing, but there was no interaction of the community or anything else. The second thing that happened was that the participation of the people was limited, let me be honest, non-existent. They weren't participating in what was going on because they couldn't. So they were making up other things, which means they were not participating in the liturgy that was going on itself. Thirdly, the architecture, art, and environment all conspired to say this is the priest's show or the bishop's show, and people were not encouraged because it was the bowling alley seating, so everyone was facing front, and everyone was trying to, if you will, do their best to make this relevant, but it just simply did not come about. And then the devotions that had nothing to do with liturgy seemed to rule the day. Before the Reformation of the Triduum, for instance, the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified on Good Friday was celebrated at 8 in the morning with rarely people attending. However, Catholic piety had the Traore, which was the 3 hours brought from Italy, where the last words of Christ were commemorated, songs were sung, but there was no question of liturgy going on at all. Also, looking at it from the scripture scholarship of today, the scripture was grossly misused, and you have the devotion ruling the day, not the liturgy. So, what happens at Vatican II? And let's follow our hermeneutic of interpreting the text of Vatican II. We start out with the liturgy document. Yes, it was the first one. However, before we do anything about that, we have to go to the document of the Church, Lumen Gentium, because we have a terrific template switch. Before Vatican II, the Church looked like a pyramid. On the top was the Pope, and then the bishop as secretary in different dioceses, priests below the bishop, then religious, and at the bottom, laymen and women who were consumers of priestly power. Everything was done for them, but certainly they were not actively involved in very much at all. After Vatican II, we have replacing the pyramid, the circle. And that is done because the church is described in terms of Scripture as the people of God. And the people of God are a community. The people of God include everyone. No one's out of a job, but both bishops and the Bishop of Rome and priests and deacons are servants of the people of God. The people of God are number one. Everyone else is in a subordinate position to enable the people of God to function. And if we take that vision, then we go to the document on the liturgy, we find out that the principal celebrant of every liturgy is the people of God. Once again, the people of God are the principal celebrant of every liturgy. That means when we're talking about what they do, they have to be made aware of this particular privilege that is theirs. being aware, all of you that are listening, means that the church has to look like the people of God are the chief celebrant. That means they have to see each other. They have to be related to each other. They have to have an altar that is visible to them and they have access to, an ambulance that they can see and also that they can hear what is proclaimed. They also have to have someone sitting in a presiding chair to move them all together and to lead them. However, they are the principal celebrant. There's so many ministries. There's the ministry of reader or lector. There is the extraordinary ministers of the Holy Communion. There are the musicians. There are the hospitality. And there's the presider. But every person there is subordinate to the people of God who are number one. We must take another Vatican document. The most important part of the Mass is the first part, the liturgy of the Word. Without the Word, we have no empowerment to celebrate the Eucharist. The community has to be called by the Word. It has to see the Word as relevant to describing what is going on in their lives, to move them to go to the table, to give thanks for what they've discovered, and to become more deeply involved in it. But that word, the verbum tells us, is a very important understanding. It first of all tells us that revelation is not God revealing truths about himself, but as the text says, God inviting human beings to a relationship with God's self through Jesus Christ, who died and was raised in spirit-filled community. Saying yes to community makes one embodiment of Christ in the arms of his Father. That's what revelation is, and the Scripture is the premier place where that revelation is offered and made present and viable and can be embraced. And finally, the last thing, the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, the celebration of liturgy has as its goal to mission people to be in the world. And what do we hear from that document? That modernism is over with. We are not condemning the modern world. We're not thumbing our nose at the modern world. We're not taking oaths against the modern world. We are in the modern world, part of the modern world, and can never go any other place but the modern world. And so that attitude of, first of all, optimism, listening to the modern world, and then also being a leaven in that world, meaning part of what's going on, influential, and being able to do our stuff as church. As you see then, a whole new vision is offered by the Second Vatican Council, and it is a privilege to be able to recall that to you. I'd like to end this particular point by offering as a summary, and I hope you enjoy this. It's from John W. O'Malley, Jesuit priest historian, and it's from his article, Vatican II, Did Anything Happen?, which is in Theological Studies, volume 67, the year is 2006, page 29 and following. And here's his summary. And permit me to smile. I may even spit a little bit in sheer joy by being able to read this. Change in the style of the church indicated by the council's vocabulary. Movement from commands to invitations, from laws to ideas, from threats to persuasion, from coercion to conscience, from monologue to conversation, from ruling to serving, from withdrawn to integrated, from vertical and top-down to horizontal, from exclusion to inclusion, from hostility to friendship, from static to changing, from passive acceptance to active engagement, from prescriptive to principled, from defined to open-ended, from behavior modification to conversion of heart, from dictates of law to dictates of conscience, from external conformity to joyful pursuit of holiness. The second part of this presentation is called the Reform of the Reform. Now, you didn't have to have a crystal ball to know in some areas that Vatican II was not going to go over. You had, first of all, certain cardinals lurking behind the arras who simply did not buy this. Cardinal Octaviani would be one of the examples. But there were other people who formed little covens of resistance. And these people were going to be encouraged in a very important way by Pope John Paul II and by Benedict XVI. I would like to devote some attention to Benedict XVI, whose maiden name was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, and who was brought to Rome in 1982 by Pope John Paul II to be the head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith and his own private theologian. I would like to simply rehearse to you some of the things that Cardinal Ratzinger said while he was head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, and some things that he did later on as Pope, to show you that a gradual erosion of what Vatican II intended has taken place in our church. First of all, Cardinal Ratzinger said that the liturgy should be directed to God, that the focus of every liturgical celebration is God. Now, with all due respect, that does not do honor to liturgical theologians who realize that liturgy is making the signs that make us. So liturgy is definitely very much part of us making signs that make us. Secondly, liturgy should be mysterious. It should be directed toward God, and therefore it should have the aura of mystery about it. And then thirdly, that it should be with the priest back to the people. These are things that he said as head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, and he also went on to say that Pope Paul VI was premature in implementing the liturgy documents. Now, this man is a person advising Pope John Paul II. And so we see gradual changing in the way the church approached liturgy. And we see other things happening where ecclesiology is being tampered with. First of all, under John Paul II, if you will, the collegiality is killed. Collegiality meaning the Pope, as head of the College of Bishops, in communion with his bishops. This is virtually killed. There is no more listening at any type of level, or debating, or discussing, or anything of the like. Gradually, that simply disappears. And what is used instead is something interesting. It's the party line continuity. Well, continuity, the church goes on. Yes, the church goes on. And what happened at Vatican II was in continuity, not with previous ways of teaching, not with previous councils, but with what was going on within the church, movements to understand Scripture, movements to appreciate the Eucharist, movements to be present in the world as leaven. But continuity also has to be balanced by, did anything happen at Vatican II? Or was it a waste of time? Or the same old thing? And that's why always we have to answer the question, what did happen? Going on further with the reform of the reform, you have the issuing of the extraordinary form of celebrating Mass, which is now in Latin. That was done, and it was by a rescript of Pope Benedict. And what does that do? Well, it divides the church even more tragically than we are divided. You celebrate the old liturgy and you get a certain type of Catholic. You celebrate the Vatican II liturgy and you get a different kind of Catholic. And yet we have this going on and that tension. The next thing we have is the new translation in English foisted upon us that made the idea that this is supposed to be mysterious. The language is abstract, it's sometimes remote, and sometimes it's unfathomable. But yet this was forced on the English-speaking Catholic Church. The next thing that we have and have to deal with is certain cultures that elected not to listen to Vatican II and therefore have produced priests and bishops who have no idea about what Vatican II really is. And they will say, we can't get the spirit of Vatican II, and there's so many different interpretations. No, they're not. If you want to go accurately, you ask, what's the literary form of the passage? What did the Council Fathers intend in this document with all the other documents included? Simply, you have to read the thing. But instead, people don't want to do that sort of thing. And so we have a whole group of people who don't understand Vatican II or have watered it down or who are not willing to go back to the sources and read it again. And therefore, we have the reform of the reform. Now, lest you all commit suicide after that, I'm going on to my third point, the present state of the Union. Now, I want to give an example of something that, and I don't want to foam at the mouth when I do this because I'm just so thrilled it happened. You will recall Cardinal Sarah gave a talk a year ago in London, and he expressed the wishes that we would return all of our liturgy to basically having the priest with his back to the people. And he said that as the head of the congregation for dying worship and the sacraments. And he said this, and I thought, I'm going to wait for a little bit and see what happens. Well, he got back to Rome, and Pope Francis had a come to Jesus talk with him, and that was the end of that. And then Pope Francis went on to say, this is the end of the reform of the reform. In other words, what Vatican II has asked, Pope Francis intends to do. And so Pope Francis, following Lumen Gentium, is a synodal pope. He believes in consultation. He doesn't care if there are arguments. He doesn't care if people disagree with him. He doesn't care about that at all. He wants the cards on the table. He wants to hear from people who are ministering to their own people in different places and different cultures, and he wants a genuine church that is in communion with one another. The next thing that we have about is the openness to discussion. Pope Francis is conspicuous for that. Thirdly, the idea of church for Pope Francis is the field hospital. He said that you don't ask people what is their cholesterol level or what is their insurance. When someone is brought in wounded, almost dying, you heal the wounds, and he says it 3 times, heal the wounds, heal the wounds. And then you take a look at Pope Francis himself, and you see that deep in his heart of hearts, he is simply a converted Vatican II person. He has the holiness to say, when I was in charge of the Jesuits in Buenos Aires, I was autocratic. I regret that. And here is the holiness of the man to look back and say, I've grown, I can grow, I can do things. Second of all, he has told the Congregation for Bishops, I want people who are not climbers, who are not careerists. I want people who smell like they're people and who have the blood and dirt of the streets on their garments. He has gone on to do things that are so incredibly human and loving, but what we see is a breath of fresh air. People love him, and yet others are so fearful, even those who might be cardinals, because they're being asked to change. And you must realize that when we hear the Gospels, the Gospel writer's intent is not to make fun of Pharisees. The Gospel writer's intent is to say, don't you bring that style of leadership into leadership in the church. And when we read the Gospels carefully, we find that Jesus made enemies with religious leaders because he believed that people were more important than rules and regulations, and that service of people was to be number one. And so we have Francis calling us back to understanding that the Second Vatican Council is not to be watered down, it's to be lived out, and he is living it out, the way he celebrates liturgy, the way he relates to people, the way he does all the major documents of Vatican II. He simply lives them out and says, the reform of the reform is over. Now, we're on to the fourth point. What can you do, or we do, with our expertise? Well, let's start in with a couple of things, and these are very basic things. You have to realize when you're dealing with anyone who is in charge, and you are going to be advising them in your area of expertise. The first thing is personal relationship. You have to get to know the person that you're going to try to talk to. Some are very fearful, some are clueless, and have no idea about how a liturgical space is to be set up, what are the areas of focus, what are the most important points to be covered. And so in getting to relate to someone else, perhaps over coffee, perhaps over a meal, perhaps trying to find common ground, is the first thing. Sometimes it means putting your light under a bushel for a little bit so you don't, if you will, frighten somebody, or don't turn them off, or don't overwhelm them. But to be the person that is attractive, the person that can listen, the person that is trying to, if you will, explore the possibilities of what this person in leadership can do. The second thing is this: to conduct a mini course in Vatican II. Now, a mini course doesn't mean you're going to talk about Vatican II. What everyone has to look at are the liturgical books, the way we do things. And if you show, I'll give some examples, if you show the liturgical books and they show you what needs to be done in this space by the people of God who are the chief celebrants of every liturgy, and that what you're going to suggest is going to facilitate the liturgical celebration, you win hearts. Let me give you some examples. First of all, when you're going to talk about, let's say, a baptismal area. Now, first of all, it's news to some people, so understand that buying the Benziger catalog portable baptismal font number 20579 is not either ideal nor helpful. But to be able to say that if baptism is entrance into the church, it should be a prominent fixture at the entrance of the church. If you look at the liturgy books, we have options, one of which is immersion. Therefore, we don't take that option away. We build an immersion pool and also a smaller one to accommodate the immersion of children. Once again, that is something that is reading the liturgical book. Then we go on to say, how is this related to the celebration of baptism, especially as it's recommended in the ritual book at Sunday Mass? Remember, we're talking about the Christian community welcomes you with great joy. And if this is done someplace with about 15 people, it doesn't look like the Christian community is celebrating a sacrament. So all of those things that you might show someone, the liturgy can come alive if the space says what the book, the liturgy book, intends it to say. And that's one simple example. There are tons of others, but that can help. The third one is this. In talking to someone who's in charge, the more people participate actively in the liturgy, the more they'll participate in church life, meaning parish life, and parish outreach to the larger world. If they do not participate in the celebration, they're certainly not going to participate in anything else that's Catholic or outreaching. And that means participating in the rite, in what's going on. That's the participation, because what's going on is the church being made. It's a process that's happening. We come and we do all these signs as God's people, as the embodiment of the Christ, the Spirit-filled embodiment of the Christ. So when we touch the Word and proclaim it, it becomes the Christ proclaiming to his people. When we sing, we become gathered by that song. When we do all of these things, they take over and possess us, and we are remade again into church, gathered and missioned. But participation in the rite and the ability to see, to hear, to be able to know that we are part of the worshiping community, all of these things are possible and create a participation that then moves people to be part of church life wherever it is. And when they are missioned to find what they found in church everywhere, the embodiment of the Christ. So we're not trying to convert people, we're trying to treat them in such a way that they'll recognize what they have themselves. And finally, the last point I would make about our expertise and what we can do is this: to be able to tell people why certain things prohibit full conscious participation in the liturgy, either because they're pillars in the way, or they're meretricious statues, or they're all sorts of things that, if you will, mar the sight line, the sound line, the accessibility. All of these things we can persuade, and by the the talent and the patience that we have, we can succeed in doing an awful lot of good by those 4 suggestions that I've made. And now, what we've all been waiting for, my conclusion. I have 2 parts to the conclusion. First of all, I would want you to understand that most of us would accept scientific evidence that evolution is the best explanation of how we got here, and as we're sitting, we're evolving. And if we apply that to church life, then from the very beginning, the Big Bang, God, who is relationship, has kneaded himself into that process so that all is relationship, all is explosive discovery, because the God we worship is relationship, Father, Son, and Spirit. The last word is never said. There is always fascination, always discovery, always newness. Well, if the centerpiece is Jesus, who evolves into the Christ by dying and being raised and made source of Spirit, and that Spirit has been sent into everyone and everything, that everything, thanks to the Spirit, is loved as it is, just the way it is, and is being moved first of all together, and then being moved forward to what lies ahead. Then we're talking about things being in flux. Vatican II in chapter 7 of the document on the church calls us a pilgrim church. And that means the last word has not been said. We are moving forward. And what's so difficult about that is the biggest temptation for members of a pilgrim church is to unpack, to find a motel and unpack and stop evolving, stop growing, stop being Christified. And when you have that, you have death. So in our areas of expertise, a consolation, we are moving on. Matthew has it very nicely in 3 parables, 2 in chapter 13. The kingdom of heaven is like a field that has both weeds and wheat in it. There'll be no separation now. Everything is mixed up, everything is messy. But that's the way it is. Or it's like a net cast into the sea that's filled with useful and useless things, but there's no judgment now. All this mess has to evolve together, and every bit of it is making some contribution, some way or other, to the, if you will, the entire Christ being formed, or as Paul puts it, to form that one new person who is Christ come to full stature. And the second little thing is this. Woody Allen has a wonderful movie called Love and Death, and it takes place in the French Revolution. And he and Diane Keaton are married, and Diane Keaton has arranged a tryst with Napoleon. And they're going to assassinate Napoleon. So just before Napoleon comes, we have Diane Keaton saying to Woody Allen, now you hide behind the drapes, and then I'll sit Napoleon down in front of this couch. You hit him over the head with a champagne bottle, and we'll get the gun and kill him. And Woody Allen said, no, I can't do it. Well, there's a knock on the door. And so Diane Keaton pushes him behind the drapes and closes them, and then goes to the door and opens the door, and it's Napoleon. And she says, oh, your bigness, come in. And he said, am I interrupting anything? And she said, no. He said, well, I thought I heard a voice. And she said, oh, I was praying. And then he said, but I thought I heard more than one voice. And she said, oh, I do both parts. And I think sometimes we get to the point of we're going to do both parts. We've known people like that say, you know, here, eat this, you'll love it, or wear this shoe, look good in it, or here's where we're going for vacation, or someone want to quarterback our lives, or even our housekeeper at one time, who was a compulsive talker. She got out of bed, and her husband was lying next to her, dead. But she didn't know that and kept on a conversation, went back to discover him later on. So you get the I do both parts. Perhaps one of the most wonderful things is to give way and to say, other people will be doing things as well, and we may be pleasantly surprised that we may be a catalyst or even a reagent and have something done that's truly wonderful. Thank you for your time and your patience, and I think Q&A start now.
Well, thank you very much, Father Dave. That was both encouraging and interesting and educational, so I appreciate it very much. Also, the hope of part 3 and the suggestions for part 4. So what we're going to do for the questions, we usually have panelists on our webinars, and we do have 3 panelists today. We have Marilyn, who is there with Marilyn Morgan, who's there with Father Dave. We have Gilbert Sungera on the phone, and I'm going to unmute him. And we have one other panelist, but I don't see that he has any audio, so sorry, Paul. We're also going to take questions from the audience, either by raising hands or sending in questions through the question function on the GoToWebinar control panel. So I'll just open the floor open to questions. And Marilyn, did you have any questions, or the others there with you?
Marilyn's coming right over here now. Which side do you want to?
Just relax. Well, I was at a conference last week, and my experience.
That's right. Get her on the screen. Oh, now she has a hello. Perfect.
I have a couple of questions. One is that what happens when we have a group of people that are willing to evolve and change, and a pastor who does not even want to engage with them, but is off to the side and puts his 2 cents in after people have made decisions and are moving, and there's no opportunity for dialogue? What do you do with that?
Okay, I'm going to make some suggestions, and it can work in some places, and some places it can't. We had a situation in a particular parish, and the deacon that was there simply wrote to the vicar for clergy and said, there are 2 groups, there are 2 entities that are being harmed. First of all, this priest who is sent here with no equipment to be able to dial and to be able to handle this. And secondly, our people who are being ruined because of this. And so I recommend that you and the personnel board find a job for him that he'll be good at and give us someone else that can do this. So it took 3 months, and the present pastor was assigned to hospital work, which is what he wanted to do to begin with. And another person was sent in to be the administrator. The deacon's the one in charge, and they're having a marvelous time. So the idea of when a person shows himself unwilling to do things, the vicar for clergy ought to be made aware of it. And I'm speaking also, Jim and Marilyn is one brought it up. I'm speaking also, having been on the personnel board for a long time. And you have to face the fact that being ordained is something that gets proven over the years. You get reordained by your people, or you don't. And some people that were ordained, it was the biggest mistake in the world, and they've gone on to verify that. It is tragic, but you have to be honest. Not everyone's ordained is infallible, and the ones that are really good, no, they're not at all. So that idea is one suggestion. The next thing is another way. What might be able, if that person is open at all, to be included, or there's someone that person trusts that could be, if you will be enticed to work on the person, so that to help the person come out. Those would be a couple of ways. But all the energy the poor people have to go through to take care of inadequate leadership is really amazing today. If we were concentrated on doing something right, it'd be great. But you had another question.
Well, my other question is, there are people who are asking questions about creating your church to serve the Latin Mass, and they want you to set it up for the Latin Mass. So that's their concern. And so what do we do? What's the answer?
Well, I'm just going to say that I will quote anyone that will help my cause. So the rescript of Pope Benedict said that the Latin Mass is to be reinstituted fully for those people who are devoted to the Latin Mass. There is no encouragement to evangelize and to have more people do it. And since it's extraordinary, there should be no place that is set up to have a Latin Mass exclusively ever. That is very much the intent of that document. And I will quote an archbishop who is a friend of mine. He was asked by a Newman chaplain, is it all right if we have a Latin Mass in the chapel because everyone's asking for it. And this good friend of mine said, well, you don't have to ask me, it's out of my hands. On the other hand, since all of those people are college, they were never alive for the Latin Mass, so how do they ever come to understand it? Who is, if you will, guiding them in that direction? Please stop it. Yeah, which is important. Also, the idea that this movement is going on further because we're getting more divided. And we have, like, for instance, we have a couple of parishes here, but if you take a look at the zip code on the checks, they're coming from covens all the way up in the north and in the wine country who want to have this regression. And it's a tough one to go through, and but that's what it says in the book. You know. Next question.
Gilbert.
This is Gilbert Singera. I had a quick question. It's a great presentation. Thank you for just making this very accessible, to making this very open. I love the suggestion, especially of walking, let's say, the committee through the different, like a baptism, through the different procedures. I'm working on a few chapels, more like hospital chapels, where they will do a liturgy of the Eucharist once a day, but then a lot of it is designed for people who need to come in for private prayer. And I'm just wondering, how do you begin helping a group think through those non-liturgical times when they're using the chapel? Because a lot of them go back to really historic, traditional, or desire for traditional looking church because they love all the sensate experience of it.
Well, thank you for your question. Also, the first document that came out from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on art and environment architecture, I believe it's paragraph 78. But anyway, it says that the space where liturgy is going to be celebrated, the Eucharist, and the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament for prayer have to be two different types of locations, because otherwise you falsify what's going on. So a challenge for your expertise, I would say, would be this, that there has to be a place where the community can celebrate Eucharist, but then the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament can be into another, in the same area, but not near where the altar and ambo and presiding chair are. It can be someplace, and in a very quiet, prayerful way. And in so doing, it can be very, very comforting. But that document, that paragraph 78, says it so beautifully because we try to do everything all at once and try to turn something in. The space where liturgy is celebrated is quite a different one from private prayer and focus on the reserved Blessed Sacrament. And I think that in the way you would design or configure something, I think you could do a very beautiful job in that. I've seen it done, and there were prayer pillows, there were all sorts of things. The lighting was different, the focus was different. It was just it just said pray. It was one of those. It was so conducive to prayer, and I think that's important. Also, when you're talking about a hospital too, people can get from the hospital also the fact that the anointing of the sick is so very important, and someplace in that chapel configuration should be a prominent place for the oil of the sick, if not all three, because again, the oil is a symbol of healing, of community touch, of medical profession, paraprofessionals, all of these people, and it can be a very powerful thing. But the idea of saying two spaces have to be separate. You can't make a place where we're going to celebrate liturgy of the Eucharist and say at the same time that very configuration is for private prayer. Also, if you make things movable, not the altar or the ambo, but chairs that could be turned in a different direction, once again, you're affirming that. I hope that helps a little bit.
That does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Father Dave, I had a question from someone else in our audience, from architect Robert Haviger, and this is kind of a follow-on to Marilyn's question. It says, recently it seems that there is a return for it being the priest's show, and they are asking for the spaces to be the older pre-Vatican II space. How can you get such a closed-minded person to be open-minded in learning what Vatican II meant, that the people of God are the principal celebrant?
Good. It is a very difficult thing to do. First of all, it almost makes you the person that has to do the confrontation. And in a case like that, I would do this, and I don't want to lay something on other poor unsuspecting people, but I would have recourse, pardon me, to the director of worship for the diocese and say, because we have so many competent directors of worship, I'm pointing at Laura Bertoni incidentally, who know what they're doing, and some people are ignorant. Then there's the modern sin in the Catholic Church, preferred stupidity, and in order to get someone to listen, someone has to maybe with some title, some clout, to persuade. But the bottom line should be no joker should get by with that type of behavior, because it's not going to happen, and it's sooner or later it's going to have to be changed. And so I think of resorting to people in authority who can say, I'm sorry, you're asking for something that we can't do, and you're not allowed to do it. Also having I hate to say, well, we did this or that. We had a wonderful subcommittee in the liturgy on art, environment, and architecture, and we also invented some procedures. And under George Niederauer of happy memory, who was our archbishop, this was enforced, and anyone that was going to do more than $500 worth of improvement on a church had to consult us, and we were bent over backwards to be available, to be kind, but also to say, well, if you're going to start doing that, don't you think you ought to bring the church in line to do this? Don't you think you ought to get rid of the bird bath baptismal font and do a whole area that is consecrated to baptism? Or don't you think you want to get rid of that altar? It looks like a ship. Why wouldn't it look like a table? You know, those things we would do. Then we have a pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph at the moment, but still, you keep trying to poison the wells. But someone who is so adamant, I think you need to be backed up by someone who has some clout and also some knowledge of Vatican II. And also, there's a transition going on right now. I'll speak frankly to you and not fool around with you. We are getting some of our good bishops really organized now in the Conference of Bishops. We've got some gems who are getting organized because you have the John Paul II bishops and the Benedict bishops. And these men are party liners, and they don't see nuances, and some of them are cultural war horses. They're fighting things like religious freedom, good heavens, and all sorts of things, and things are eluding them, but they were appointed precisely because they told the lie. And they are disappearing, and more bishops are beginning to organize, and then they have to undo all the work in their dioceses. And I could mention names, so we got some gems of people. Blaise Supich, obviously. You've got John Wester. You have Randy Calvo, Steve Blair, Joe Pepe. You've got all sorts of people that are, Bob McElroy, my gosh, all these wonderful people. And they're going to move along, but to have them move along, it's going to take a while. So back to the initial question, please do consult an authority figure who is on the ball to get that person and make that person a little uncomfortable. They really just say, oh yes, and bow down. Oh no, they should perspire just a bit.
Thank you, Father. Robert followed up that with just the comment, thank you for the answer. Sadly, we are losing many of our directors of worship at the diocesan level. I do hope the organization of the bishops that you mentioned can reverse this trend. Mm-hmm. And I will also say that a project I recently completed, that is pretty much the strategy that I used, was to meet with the director of worship first and find out which things I would be able to get his backing on, and then pushed for those things. And then I would say, well, Father so-and-so really needs to review this before we can move forward with it. And that was actually very, very helpful. The one area where we often struggle the most, and you mentioned, is the immersion font. There are so many people that have so many various issues with it, from how much space it takes up to how difficult it is to maintain, how it's a safety hazard for the children in their parish. And I know that all of these things can be overcome by, design one way or the other, but there just seems to be, both from the pastor and the committee, everyone, it's a very hard sell. I will say that.
Jim, when you were saying that, I just think of Blaise Pascal has in his work Pensée. He says this: there's enough light for those who want to see light, and enough darkness for those who want to see darkness. And if you can get someone on board, like, and say, okay, the kids will drown in the baptismal pool, okay, fine, and or this or that. It's the same way with. I have some dear friends of mine, they're pastors. There's no cup in sight for the lay people at Mass. I say, Phyllis, look, I'll write some stuff up for you. I'll give a talk. I'll do anything you want me to do. And I said, but you have to see it. Again, traffic to the tabernacle. Grimm says it over and over again. You're supposed to receive the consecrated bread and wine from that Eucharist, not from the refrigerator, but from this particular celebration. To get that across, well, we can't guess how many people are going to be, but there are ways of doing it, and it's so easy. It's not rocket science, but all that, to God, what we have to do to get people to celebrate liturgy, the most important thing. And some will just not do it. And I love your thing, though, about going to see the director of worship first and find out what you got to deal with. Anyway, that's fine.
Well, I appreciate that very much. Anybody else have any questions, either in the room or on the phone?
I have a question, Jim. Another comment that people make about baptismal fonts is the placement of it, and they're stuck in the fact that we can't all see what we're doing. Can we have screens in the front to show what's happening at the baptism? We put it up in the front so that everybody can see, and yet no one interacts with that font at any time except when there's a baptism. So, I mean, those are all big questions that we deal with constantly.
Yeah. You just said, first of all, moving things around. Like some people have a big font up there for the Easter season,
right?
And it's not where they normally do the thing. You say, well, how about at the entrance of the church where we, and then could you tell the people to turn around? I mean, just turn around and look. As we start the Easter Vigil, I'll just say, yoo-hoo, turn around. And there's enough sense to come in out of the rain. But that sort of thing. Don't you see that if we have it here and we have all these options available, you're going to wind up with something far more successful than what you're doing at the moment, and also you're making bad signs. And when you have like a fly-by-night baptismal font that you cart out, including dirty water and dirty linen to touch the children with, anyway, you do that, you say, oh, this is sort of a temporary fly-by-night thing. Whereas you see a baptismal area, but this is important, and you have to get people to understand that. Otherwise, they're making these bad signs. And I convince them, and some have these objections. They're ready to go under, but they have to, this little ack fire like this and this and this and this, and you think, okay, come on, but relax. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? You're gonna have to spend some bucks. But let's take a look at, Jim, I don't want to blab away here, but take a look at the budget in every parish. Is the thoughts of many hearts are revealed. You take a look at, let's say, parties, and that it says $80,000, and then liturgy, $1.50. I'm exaggerating, of course. And you say, where are their priorities? It's certainly not on those paragraphs from Vatican II.
Well, I have one final question from another attendee, Gail Franchione. She asks, is there a good overview for Vatican documents, either a book or a DVD or something? I would assume she means that kind of summarizes I mean, obviously there's a lot of documents, but maybe something you could use with a committee or something.
Sure. Let me suggest, first of all, let me give you that reference again. Jim O'Malley has this article John O'Malley, rather, in Theological Studies. It's volume 67, and the year is 2006, beginning in page 29. And it says, Vatican II, did anything happen? That is a marvelous introduction to all the Vatican II documents. Another one, Jesuit priest Joe Egan has Vatican II, Renewal or Reconstruction. And it takes every document, and it also has discussion points so that people can deal with the text, but it's also very available. You know, even with Vatican II's documents, and I'm talking about panegyric, and wonderful things are said, but there's a Vaticanese about it too. And then, first of all, the language is inclusive. And whereas these books, the two sources I've mentioned, would be very, very helpful. And I think those would be the two I'd recommend. Yeah.
Could you repeat the name and author of the second document?
The second one is Joseph Egan, E-A-G-A-N, and it's called Vatican II, Renewal, Reconstruction, which way you want to talk about it. And that takes care of the whole, it takes all 16 documents. It's very available, it's crystal clear, and it is a very wonderful piece of work. And I would suggest that would be a helpful one.
Great. Well, thank you very much. In addition to the questions, Father, we had several comments about how much people enjoyed the talk, and I know I certainly did as well. Really appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today and encourage many of us, I think. So thank you very much for that. I would just like to remind everyone that we will have another webinar next month on February 21st. Robert Habiger will be giving a presentation, which is actually a good follow-up from today's presentation, called Designing Worship Spaces, the Advantages of a Central Plan Model. And Father Dave's already alluded to one of those. So thank you all for attending. Don't forget to fill out the survey at the completion of the webinar. We really do appreciate your input. And I hope to see all of you here again next month. And thank you very much, Father. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Pleasure. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, bye-bye.